In a previous lesson, we had begun talking about the First Continental Congress and seeing how the colonies were intending to organize. This was not the first Congress that they called. They had called the Stamp Act Congress in New York in 1765. And now they were calling the Continental Congress in response to the Intolerable Acts. 12 of the 13 American colonies sent delegates to Philadelphia in September of 1774. Only Georgia did not attend. The reason Georgia didn't attend is that they were having troubles with Native Americans, and they hoped that the British would help them. So they decided not to aggravate the situation and instead did not attend the Continental Congress. The Americans had also invited Canada to attend the Continental Congress, but just like they decided not to attend the Stamp Act Congress almost a decade earlier, they did not attend the First Continental Congress. 56 delegates from those 12 colonies attended, and many of them were quite famous in their own colony, having sat on the Legislative Assembly. Some of them were conservative, such as John Jay, who argued that the colonies ought to find a common policy to force Parliament to rescind its intolerable acts. He hoped for reconciliation. Other radicals included Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, and John Adams. They argued that the Congress ought to have a more forceful response, compose a statement of colonial rights and the abuses of Parliament, but they still hoped for restoration. Almost everyone was wanting restoration. Congress decided on the following measures. First, they agreed to create the Continental Association. Now, this was a continent-wide boycott of British goods to begin in December 1774. This was a full ban. Any colony that did not agree would not be traded with. So, this was incredibly effective. In fact, British imports dropped over 90% in 1775. It worked, and it worked well. They also sent an official petition to the king to end the Intolerable Acts. But in doing so, they were implicitly agreeing that the king still had control over the colonies. Their problem, they said, was with Parliament, not with King George III. They created a list of grievances, and this was delivered by Ben Franklin to Parliament. Parliament refused to address it, and the king refused to read it. They also created a colonial Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights included life, liberty, and property, just like the English Bill of Rights. English rights also were included for the colonists. They included, for example, the right to representation, the right to local trials, the right to peaceably assemble, rights to petition the king, and the right to not have a standing army. And finally, Congress created local committees of safety, as they were called. Now, this is an important part, and I want to go into a little bit more detail here. The question at hand is, how do you create a country? What kept this movement organized? What would cause 13 colonies to stay united? After all, there was no police at this time. There was no Continental Army at this time. In fact, there was no way to enforce that these colonies would agree. Many of the loyalists were actually in high position, governors and other members of assembly. So how would you unite 13 different colonies? Each local county, town, and city might have different opinions. So what Congress did by creating this Committee of Safety is they began the process of uniting the colonies. Each town, each city, even each local county would have different committees. Now, the first committee was called the Committee of Correspondence. Their job was to move letters and newsprint from colony to colony. I want to think about this just a little bit further. At this time, recall, there was no internet. There was no TV. There was not even radio or telephone. In fact, there was no way for one colony to know what was happening in another colony except by moving newspapers and by moving letters. And so by creating a Committee of Correspondence, they were actually creating the means by which one colony would know what was happening in another place. This was very important. There was also a Committee of Inspection. Now, these members, their job was to make sure the boycott was followed. They would keep track of what everyone was importing. They would keep track of who was acting like a patriot and who was acting like a loyalist. Later in the Revolution, they would also collect taxes and recruit soldiers. There was a third committee. This was the Committee of Safety. Now, these members executed the acts of Congress. If Congress decided to do something, it was these people who made sure it was done. This was important because there was not an executive in each colony except the governor. But who appointed the governor? The king. So we needed a new executive, someone who would execute whatever Congress decided. The Committee of Safety did that. Sometimes membership in the committees was elected by the different people in the colonies. Sometimes it was appointed by the legislative assemblies. But often, people were in multiple committees. The important thing to realize about these committees is that they derived their authority from Congress, not from the colonial legislatures and not from London. This was the first time that Congress had actually decided something and everyone went along with it. But the most important thing was that they permitted community. We call this imagined community. As people began to hear what was happening in Boston, they began to have a sense of sympathy for what was going on and began to think, well, what's happening there could also happen here. This allowed them to think that they were in community with Boston. It was the movement of information that allowed this kind of community. And that's the only thing that would allow these 13 colonies to come together. An imagined community that was based on information being disseminated all around the colonies. These committees also created order where there had been chaos, permitting people to make a difference. And they investigated and meted out punishment, usually by civil excommunication. Now, what that meant is if somebody refused to obey the boycott, well, their name would be put in the paper, their company would be mentioned in the paper, their shop would be specifically identified in the paper. And the next thing you know, they would either come around to the patriot way of thinking or they would leave. They would make somebody a pariah rather than actual bloodshed. And these committees were composed not only of elites, but commoners. Common men began to realize that all kinds of people can have an activity for their own political welfare. Now, the results were quite astonishing. I already mentioned over 90% boycott in 1775. But they also said, with great foresight, if this does not fix the intolerable acts, the Continental Congress will meet again in 1 year. King George III and Parliament refused to negotiate. Instead, Parliament passed a new act, making it illegal for the colonies to trade with anyone but Great Britain. They left out a couple colonies because they thought that these other colonies weren't going to go along, but they were mistaken. All 12 colonies that were at that Continental Assembly agreed, and Georgia even followed suit as well. And also there became increased financial independence from Britain. Because the colonies began to follow this boycott with great efficiency, they became financially independent, and it increased their colonial interdependence. So my main point in this lesson is this: the colonies were organizing and finding identity more with each other than they were with London.